It's June 2nd, 2010. 17,738 fans file into Comerica Park to watch the Detroit Tigers play, and not one of them has any clue they are about to witness history. Armando Galarraga, a 27-year-old starter with a career 4.62 ERA, will be perfect tonight. With one asterisk, he will retire every batter he faces, and be one of the worst blown calls of all time away from the 21st official perfect game in MLB history. Had it stood, it would have gone down as one of the most random perfect games the sport had ever seen. Galarraga pitched just 6 career big league seasons, and finished his career with a 4.78 ERA. His 2.5 career B-WAR would have been the second lowest of any pitcher to ever throw a perfect game. This means it would have been extremely random, but being second does mean that there's a first that we have to talk about. There are also the other 23, who all had better careers than Galarraga. Perfect games have been thrown by good pitchers, Hall of Famers, and some guys who weren't all that good outside of their one shining moment. There's a lot to unpack here. So without further ado, here are all 24 perfect games in MLB history. Coming onto your screen right now is a timeline featuring every perfect game in MLB history, beginning with the first one in 1880. They have been placed across the timeline by year and vertically by the career WAR of the pitcher who threw it. To get things going, we are going to need to start at the very beginning. The history of perfect games takes us all the way back to the Rutherford B. Hayes administration with a pitcher named Lee Richmond. He was worth 11.6 career WAR, but looking into him further makes for a pretty interesting story. His 1880 stats for the Worcester Ruby legs make for 1880's weirdness in a nutshell. Every number on here looks completely foreign by modern standards. For example, if a starter were to have 32 games started in 2023, he would be top 10 in all of baseball. Lee Richmond in 1880 had that many of each kind of decision. He also managed to lead the league in games started, games finished, and saves, which is especially notable when you consider that games finished only accounts for games that weren't started by that pitcher. Does that make it weird that he has more games finished than appearances that he didn't start in? Yeah, but it's 1880, so let's move on. Here's some Lee Richmond stories for your viewing pleasure while we're at it. Richmond was Ivy League educated, having gone to Brown. While he was there, he learned a curveball, and then was told by a physics professor there that it was physically impossible. He then made his first pro appearance as a 22-year-old in 1879 for a lofty fee of $10. When he returned to school, he still wanted to play baseball. It was eventually ruled that he could, but no other player who had played professional games was allowed to play collegiately after that. This ruling set a precedent for amateurism in collegiate athletics that continued into the 21st century. Clearly, Richmond was very studious, so much so that it factored into his perfect game. He was up until 6:30 that morning at some graduation events. He then pitched a perfect game and then graduated from Brown 4 days later. After his retirement, he became a teacher. Now, Lee Richmond may have been the first pitcher to ever throw a perfect game, but he ended up not even being the best pitcher to throw a perfect game that year. It wasn't even really all that close, because John Montgomery Ward was a Hall of Famer. People talk a lot about Shohei Ohtani and Babe Ruth as two-way players, and they definitely should talk about them, but John Ward did it all first. As a hitter, he had seasons leading the league in games, at-bats, and stolen bases, and as a pitcher, he led the league in pretty much every major stat at some point or another. His perfect game, outdueling future Hall of Famer Pud Galvin for a 5-0 win, came just 5 days after that of Richmond, and would be the last in the National League until Jim Bunning did it over 80 years later. We're finally moving into the 20th century, and with a name that pretty much everybody knows. Cy Young had one of the longest and most successful careers that baseball had ever seen. Probably the best way to show this is in all the career counting numbers that Young holds records in. These include things that are both good and bad. Young pitched way more than anybody else. He wasn't only a compiler though, because his perfect game was a part of one of the most dominant stretches in MLB history. It was part of a stretch where Young did not give up a run for 45 consecutive innings, or a hit for over 25. Both of those numbers were MLB records at the time, and only the scoreless innings streak has been passed since. His career WAR is high enough that you can't even see it right now. If you wait long enough for it to finally show up, Young's career WAR is here. With MLB's third perfect game, we're seeing the highest WAR total on this list, and it's not even close. There are other perfect games to be had though, so let's move on. It took only 4 years for Young's perfect game to get followed up by another. This one came from another Hall of Famer. His name was Addie Joss. Nicknamed the Human Hairpin, the tall starter made the Hall in spite of only playing 9 years in the big leagues. In all of those years, Joss never posted an ERA above his rookie year number of 2.77. His perfect game included only 3 strikeouts and was completed in just 74 pitches, the fewest of any recorded perfect game. Neither pitcher in the game allowed an earned run, as Joss and his Cleveland Naps won 1-0. The game from Addie Joss leaves us with 4 perfect games, featuring 3 Hall of Famers. Following that one, though, there would only be 1 perfect game for the next 48 years. During that time, we had the entire careers of Bob Feller, Grover Cleveland Alexander, Lefty Grove, Carl Hubble, and all but 1 year of Walter Johnson. None of them was able to do it, though. The only pitcher who was a man named Charlie Robertson. In his 4th MLB start, 6.4 career WAR starter Charlie Robertson threw a perfect game against Hall of Famers Ty Cobb and Harry Heilman. This being the one pitcher to achieve this feat over a 48-season stretch just further exemplifies how truly random a perfect game is. As good as a pitcher needs to be to throw one, what they really need is to be lucky. With Robertson's perfecto out of the way, though, we skip forward another 34 years to 1956. This is one of the big ones, the legendary 1956 World Series perfect game of Don Larsen. For having thrown maybe the most famous perfect game in World Series history, the rest of Don Larsen's career was not nearly as smooth. His Sabre article introduces him as a bundle of contradictions, an imperfect man who disdained training rules and had a mediocre major league career in spite of having pitched the greatest game in World Series history. This description of Larsen is spot on. His career was extremely mediocre. His career ERA plus was 99. Almost exactly league average. His best season was probably 1956, but nothing that would ever lead you to expect what came in Game 5. On that day, Larsen had a kind of control that, in his own words, he had never had in his life. The second at-bat of the game, against future Hall of Famer Pee Wee Reese, was the only of the game to even get to 3 balls off of Larsen. Against a lineup featuring 5 Hall of Famers, Larsen retired every batter he faced in just 97 pitches. He was the 1956 World Series MVP, and to this day has the only perfect game in World Series history. With Larsen's perfect game, there was a new era of perfectos on the horizon. Suddenly, after only a couple for nearly 50 years, there would be 3 perfect games in 5, and all coming from Hall of Famers. In order, they were Jim Bunning, Sandy Koufax, and Catfish Hunter, all guys who made the Hall of Fame out of very different paths. Koufax made the Hall off of one of the greatest 5-year peak runs that baseball had ever seen. The other two compiled results over a longer stretch, with Hunter's Hall of Fame case also largely resting on postseason success as well. Bunning is pretty interesting though, because he is someone that I think is pretty underdiscussed historically for how good he really was. He posted 6 seasons in his career with an ERA under 3, and a 7th still with one under 3.5. The 4 best of those came in his 4-year peak with the Phillies, when Bunning posted ERAs of 2.63, 2.60, 2.41, and 2.29 back-to-back-to-back-to-back. In the last of these, Bunning led the league in starts, shutouts, innings pitched, strikeouts, and batters faced. He probably should have won that year's Cy Young, but ended up getting snubbed for a guy who finished with 3 whole less WAR than him. It was during his first year in red pinstripes, though, that Bunning delivered his pièce de résistance. It was Father's Day 1964, and the father of 7 threw a perfect game against the Mets at Shea Stadium. He struck out 6 of the last 9 batters he faced to finish with 10 for the game, the most of any perfect game to that point. It was a record that would hold for exactly 1 year and 80 days. As great as he was, the exploits of Jim Bunning had nothing on the left arm of God. Sanford Koufax was one of the most dominant pitchers to ever play baseball. He earned 3 pitching Triple Crowns over a 4-year stretch, and with those 3 Cy Young awards. He is the only pitcher since integration to earn the Triple Crown 3 times. In that time, only Roger Clemens has even done it twice. He also completed 4 no-hitters during his career, the last of which was his perfect game in 1965. Koufax struck out 14 Chicago Cubs during that game. To this day, no one has struck out more in a perfect game before or since, and only once has it been matched. It's quite simply one of the greatest games ever pitched. Looking at it through the lens of game score, a Bill James metric that rates games based off their stats, it's tied for the 4th best pitching performance of all time. This one was pure domination, and it leads us to Catfish Hunter, the last perfect game of the 60s. He would go on to become a key cog in the A's dynasty of the 70s, but well before that, in the A's first year in Oakland, a 22-year-old Catfish Hunter threw a perfect game against the Expos. The future Hall of Famer struck out 11. You know it doesn't make sense? Nolan Ryan never threw a perfect game. Neither did Steve Carlton or Tom Seaver. You know who did throw one during the 1980s? 3 pitchers named Len Barker, Mike Witt, and Tom Browning. Those 3 combined for less career WAR than Kevin Appier. They were all perfectly fine big leaguers. You also probably wouldn't ever hear me talking about them if we weren't talking about perfect games. I'm sorry to gloss over them, but there are more notable pitchers to talk about in the 90s. The 90s brought with it 4 perfect games, all coming from pitchers who made at least 3 All-Star appearances and recorded over 45 career WAR. The first of these came from Dennis Martinez, who had just 5 strikeouts in his perfect game. The only pitcher to have thrown one with less since 1900 is Addie Joss. The pitcher was in his second of 3 consecutive All-Star seasons when his perfect game came about. He would go on to lead the league in ERA, shutouts, and complete games that year, on his way to a 5th-place Cy Young finish. A native of Nicaragua, Martinez became the first pitcher born outside the United States to ever throw a perfect game in MLB. After Martinez, it was 3 years to the day later that the next perfect game came by. Kenny Rogers would start an All-Star game and finish 5th place in Cy Young voting over a decade later as a 41-year-old in Detroit. It was in his late 20s, though, that his best outing was unleashed. It was July 28, 1994, when Kenny Rogers dominated the lowly 94 Angels. He was lucky he did it when he did, too, because just 15 days and 3 starts later, the 94 season was ended with the strike. The 94 strike knocked out baseball into the 95 season, but with the return to play, the rest of the 90s brought 2 perfect games in 2 years. They coincidentally both came from Yankees named David. David Wells came first, who in his perfect game year finished behind only Roger Clemens and Pedro Martinez for the Cy Young Award. In spite of that, his perfect game feels pretty unlikely when you look back at it. I could tell you this story, but let's hear it from the man himself.
It was just, one thing led to another. Jimmy Fallon, let's have a drink. Seth Meyers, let's have a drink. So, just the whole cast and everybody there, we just started getting after it. And, 5:30 in the morning, I didn't know which way was up.
Wells woke up with a violent hangover, but was able to overcome it to strike out 11 Twins and throw over 65% strikes on his way to the 15th perfect game in the MLB, and the first ever thrown by a Yankee in the regular season. There's something special about a perfect game at Yankee Stadium, and we were gifted with another the very next year. This one's circumstances made it a lot less unlikely. As a matter of fact, the lead up to this game in many ways foreshadowed what was to come. It was Yogi Berra Day at Yankee Stadium, and the first pitch was thrown out by Don Larsen. There was a 33-minute rain delay in the 3rd inning, but things were otherwise smooth for Cone against a 4th-place Expos team. All things considered, Cone was a pretty reasonable perfect game pitcher. He was a former Cy Young winner, 2-time strikeout leader, and would end his career as a 5-time World Series champion. Many would argue that Cone should have garnered more Hall of Fame consideration, but even then, even Cone could not hold a candle to the next perfect game pitcher. Say what you want about any of the other pitchers in this video, but Randy Johnson is undoubtedly one of the greatest to ever touch a baseball. He currently sits as one of 4 members of the 4,000 Strikeout Club. Only all-time greats Nolan Ryan, Roger Clemens, and Steve Carlton join him. He made it to second all-time in strikeouts despite having less innings pitched than anyone else inside the top 10. On his way to those strikeouts, Johnson racked up 5 Cy Young Awards, which is second to only Clemens all-time. 4 of them came in a row, which is something that only Greg Maddux can match Johnson in. Stat for stat, accolade for accolade, there are very few pitchers who are even in the same vicinity as the big unit. This is quite simply one of the most dominant pitchers to ever live. In 2004, Johnson was still an electrifying force, finishing second in Cy Young as a 40-year-old just 2 years removed from his Cy Young four-peat. It was in May of that year that Johnson delivered another career performance. Pitching against an eventual division-winning Braves team, Johnson not only threw a perfect game, but finished within 1 strikeout of Sandy Koufax's perfect game strikeout record. With this outing, Johnson became the oldest pitcher to ever throw a perfect game, in addition to one of the best. We would see one more in the 2000s, as 5 years after Johnson, everyone's favorite speedrunner took his turn at perfection. Mark Buehrle was a good pitcher for a pretty long time. Was he a Hall of Famer? Probably not. But was he a very good pitcher? Absolutely. With the Buehrle perfect game, Dwayne Wise gave us one of the great defensive plays in baseball history.
That ball hit deep into left center field. Wise back, makes the catch!
The Buehrle Perfecto brings us to one of the strangest eras in the history of MLB perfect games. To begin the 2010s, there were 5 perfect games in 3 years. With this random explosion of perfectos, we had games from guys with 2 of the 3 lowest career WARs in the history of perfect games. The first of these came on Mother's Day 2010, when Dallas Braden was perfect against the Rays. Braden's mother had passed away from melanoma when he was a senior in high school, and the pain of that loss had made the holiday one of personal disdain for Braden. He stayed out late the night before his Mother's Day start, making him hungover and late for his start prep the next day. He made it to the mound regardless for his start, and in turn honored his mother in the best way he possibly could have. He only struck out 6 Rays, but on May 9th, 2010, Dallas Braden was perfect. It's as heartwarming a story as any in this video, and the shot of Braden embracing his grandmother after the game is as good as any you'll find. This game made for the first of 2 perfect games in May of 2010 alone, and what better way to split 2 pitchers who combined for less than 6 career WAR than with a first ballot Hall of Famer. In 2010, Roy Halladay was in his first season in Philadelphia, and was in the midst of one of the most successful post-trade seasons of all time. Not only did he post a league-leading 21 wins and an ERA under 2.5, but he also recorded 2 no-hitters, one a perfect game and one the second postseason no-hitter of all time. For his performances that season, Halladay won the Cy Young Award, making him one of just 7 pitchers to win one in both leagues. It was an absolutely dominant season, and Halladay was at his best on May 29th of that year. The Doc was perfect against the Marlins, striking out 11 and only having to shake off Carlos Ruiz 1 time. It was an all-time great performance from an all-time great pitcher. Halladay's 64.2 career B-WAR ranks him 3rd of all pitchers to ever throw perfect games, behind only Cy Young and Randy Johnson. Armando Galarraga's near-perfect game was 3 days later, but the next one to get officially finished came in 2012 with the guy with the lowest career WAR in this entire video. Philip Humber ended his career with an ERA over 5. His 2012, perfect game included, was worth negative 1.5 WAR and an ERA pushing 6.5. This is, by far, the most random perfect game of all time. But what an achievement. Going into the 2010s, there had been 2 perfect games in a season exactly once in the entire history of the achievement. 2010 joined that group, but 2012 was on an entirely different level. Philip Humber would be the first of 3, and after him, we had 2 bona fide aces. Matt Cain's perfect game placed him as the clear frontrunner for that year's Cy Young. He would end up finishing 6th, but this game ranks out as one of the best performances of all time. He matched Sandy Koufax's perfect game record with 14 strikeouts, and in turn matched his 4th place on the game score leaderboard. He was pitching against a genuinely awful 2012 Astros team that finished last in both record and offense, but it still holds up as one of the great stat lines ever produced. It's unfortunate that this game has to share the spotlight with another. Enter King Felix. Felix Hernandez was also a Cy Young candidate in 2012, 2 years after winning the award in 2010. He was really good in his prime, and capped it here with the game of his career. He struck out 12 Rays to become the 3rd pitcher to throw a perfect game against Tampa in 4 years. This Rays offense wasn't quite as good as the one that had been dominated by Braden or Buehrle, but it was still a team that won 90 games. King Felix was able to completely shut them down, and ended the game with one of baseball's iconic shots.
The 2-2. He got him! 34 years, 119 games. It's finally happened. A perfect game by a Seattle Mariner. It was done by the King.
We had 6 perfect games in 4 years. Then we didn't have one for over a decade. Out of all the elite pitchers to come through the game in the 2010s and early 2020s, the one to break the seal was Domingo Germán? Of all things, what it took to end an over decade-long perfect game drought was Domingo Germán and the disaster that was the 2023 A's. He threw 99 pitches and struck out 9. Germán enters 2024 with the 2nd lowest WAR of any perfect game pitcher. Perfect games are interesting because they happen virtually at random. They probably happen more to bad offenses than good ones, but they certainly don't only happen against bad offenses. The average team to have a perfect game thrown against them would finish 20th in offense in a 30-team MLB. 5 of them since 1900 have come against top 10 offenses. Hilariously, the best 2 offenses to ever have a perfect game against them were the Rays in back-to-back years. 11 of 24 perfect games have come against teams that ended up with winning records, and one of them, Tom Browning's in 1988, was against the team that won the World Series. It's one of the most exclusive achievements in sports, yet it includes the careers of Charlie Robertson and Philip Humber. In many ways, the perfect game club makes no sense. The question is, who's going to be the one to join it next?